The courtroom was quieter than I expected. Not peaceful, just held, as if every sound had been asked to wait its turn. Shoes moved carefully across the tiled floor, papers were placed instead of dropped. Even breathing felt deliberate. I sat at the narrow table with my hands folded, fingers resting lightly against each other, aware of how still they needed to be. Across the aisle, my husband looked comfortable. Not relaxed in a careless way, comfortable in the way of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. His jacket was open, one ankle rested casually over the other knee. He glanced around the room as if it were a place he belonged, not a place meant to measure consequences. When his attorney leaned in to whisper something, my husband smiled, just briefly. It wasn't cruel. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of smile meant for private reassurance, not public display. Still, I felt it land, not like a blow, more like confirmation. I kept my eyes forward. The bench was polished, the wood darker than I remembered from the last time I'd been here. The seal behind the judge caught the light in a way that made it look older than it probably was. Official, final. I focused on those details because focusing on him felt dangerous. My husband shifted in his seat and glanced in my direction. His eyes passed over me quickly, like he was checking off an item on a list. There was no anger there, no resentment, just dismissal, as if my presence was procedural rather than personal. I felt the smallest pull of doubt tighten in my chest. Maybe he was right to be this calm. Maybe I had misunderstood the stakes. Maybe this really was just paperwork to him and I was the one who had read too much meaning into it. I inhaled slowly through my nose, counting the breath without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. I let it out just as carefully. I straightened my spine against the chair, not to appear confident, just to stay upright. The judge hadn't spoken yet. She was reviewing something, her glasses resting low on her nose, eyes moving steadily across the page. The room seemed to bend around her silence. Every second stretched a little longer than the one before it. My attorney leaned closer to me. "Just listen," she whispered. I nodded, though I hadn't said anything that suggested otherwise. Listening was something I'd become very good at. Across the room, my husband cleared his throat softly, not impatiently, just enough to remind everyone he was there. When the sound echoed faintly, he gave a half smile, almost apologetic, as if to say he hadn't meant to interrupt. I wondered, not for the first time, how he managed to look so reasonable in moments like this, how easily that version of him appeared when it mattered. The judge turned a page. I noticed how cold the air felt against my wrists exposed beneath the sleeves of my blouse, how my shoes pressed flat against the floor, grounding me in a way that was both comforting and unforgiving. There was nowhere else to be, no other posture to take. My husband leaned back again, confidence settling into him like a habit. He whispered something else to his attorney and chuckled quietly. It wasn't loud enough to draw attention. It didn't need to be. The sound was contained, controlled, perfectly timed. I felt heat rise behind my eyes and stopped it before it had a chance to become anything visible. This wasn't the place. This wasn't the moment. I kept my face neutral, my expression composed, even as a familiar thought brushed past my mind. Maybe I had already lost. The judge lifted her gaze, scanning the room slowly. Her eyes passed over me, then over him, then back to the papers in front of her. She didn't speak, she didn't react, she simply continued reading, as if what she held in her hands carried more weight than the people waiting for her words. The silence deepened. I became aware of my pulse, steady but present, a quiet reminder that I was still here, that whatever this day brought, I would be sitting through it, minute by minute, without interruption. I told myself not to anticipate anything, not disappointment, not relief. Anticipation had a way of making things hurt more than they needed to. Still, as I sat there watching my husband's easy posture, his quiet confidence, the way he seemed untouched by the gravity of the room, a single, unwelcome assumption settled into place. By the time the judge finally spoke, I was certain of one thing. This day was not going to end in my favor. When I think about our marriage now, I don't reach first for the ending. I remember the beginning because it was real. It wasn't rushed or dramatic or swept up in illusion. It was built slowly, with intention, the way grown people build things when they believe they have time. We met later than most. By then, we both had careers, habits, and opinions that didn't bend easily. That felt like a strength at the time. We talked about everything: work, family, money, the kind of life we wanted. There was comfort in knowing where the other stood. When we married, it felt less like a leap and more like a decision we had reviewed carefully and agreed upon. Our life settled into routines that felt solid: morning coffee at the same small table by the window, groceries on Sunday afternoons, quiet dinners during the week, longer ones on Fridays when we let ourselves linger. We divided responsibilities without keeping score. If I handled one thing, he handled another. It felt balanced, fair. I trusted him, not in the blind way people talk about in stories, but in the grounded way that comes from consistency. He showed up. He followed through. When he said he would do something, it got done. When I needed support, it was there, uncomplicated and steady. I adjusted my life to fit ours, but it didn't feel like a loss. I turned down a promotion once because it would have meant travel we both agreed we didn't want. I shifted my schedule so our evenings lined up better. I took on more of the domestic rhythm because I was better at it and because at the time I wanted to be. These weren't sacrifices I resented. They were choices I made willingly, believing they were part of building something shared. He relied on me in quiet ways. For reminders, for smoothing things over, for holding the emotional temperature of the house steady. I was good at that. I liked being someone he leaned on. It made me feel useful, needed, anchored. Looking back, I can see the first small moment when something tilted, but at the time it barely registered. It was ordinary enough to ignore. We were at a dinner with friends, the kind of casual gathering where everyone talks over each other and no one keeps track of who finishes a sentence. I mentioned an idea I'd been working on at my job, something I was proud of, and before I could finish explaining it, he cut in, not sharply, just smoothly. He rephrased what I was saying, adding his own interpretation, steering the conversation forward. No one noticed, or if they did, they didn't comment. I smiled and let it go. It wasn't worth correcting. It didn't feel intentional. He was enthusiastic, helpful even. Later that night, I mentioned it gently. He looked surprised, then amused. I was just trying to help, he said, and I believed him. There was no reason not to. That's how it began, not with disrespect, but with small, reasonable explanations. Each one made sense on its own. As time passed, I found myself adjusting in ways that felt minor but accumulated quietly. I shortened my stories. I checked his mood before bringing things up. I learned which topics energized him and which ones made him disengage, and I gravitated naturally toward the former. It felt like consideration, like partnership. He accepted these adjustments easily, not with demands or expectations, but with comfort, with the ease of someone who didn't have to negotiate for space because it was already being offered. Our life looked good from the outside. Friends commented on how steady we seemed, how well we worked together. I agreed with them. I believed it myself. Stability has a way of convincing you that everything beneath it must also be sound. I didn't notice how rarely he adjusted for me. If he was tired, plans shifted. If he was stressed, the house grew quieter. If his work demanded more, mine became more flexible by default. None of this felt wrong in the moment. It felt practical, loving even. Someone had to bend, and I was good at it. There was comfort in being the adaptable one. It gave me a sense of control. If I adjusted well enough, anticipated enough, smoothed things out early enough, nothing would crack. I told myself this was maturity, that marriages weren't about equal motion at every step, but about understanding when to yield. I didn't feel erased, not yet. I felt involved, responsible, chosen. What I couldn't see then was how rarely the balance tipped back. He received the space I made without questioning it, without noticing, or perhaps without needing to. And I continued stepping aside in small, almost invisible ways, trusting that the center would hold. At that stage, I didn't feel diminished. I felt committed. I believed at what I was giving was being held with care, even if I couldn't always see it. I didn't yet understand that trust, once it stops being mutual, doesn't break all at once. It thins. The change didn't arrive with conflict. There was no argument that marked it, no moment I could point to and say that was when it began. It happened the way erosion always does, gradually, predictably, without noise. I started noticing it in conversations, not the big ones, but the everyday exchanges that make up a life. I would begin a sentence and stop halfway through, letting it trail off because finishing it felt like more effort than it was worth. Not because I was afraid of disagreement, but because disagreement had become tiring. When I did offer an opinion that differed from his, he didn't argue. He simply paused, tilted his head slightly, and responded with a calm explanation that made my point sound unnecessary. Not wrong, just redundant. I found myself nodding along, not because I agreed, but because continuing felt like pushing against something smooth and immovable. I softened my language without realizing it. I think replaced I know. Maybe crept in where certainty used to live. I framed my thoughts as suggestions rather than statements, questions rather than conclusions. It felt polite, considerate, easier. He rarely interrupted me outright. He didn't need to. The rhythm had already shifted. By the time I finished speaking, I was often unsure whether what I'd said mattered enough to repeat, so I didn't. Disagreeing began to feel like work. Not emotionally charged work, just draining. It required explanation, clarification, patience. Agreeing required nothing at all, so I chose efficiency. I told myself this was compromise, that this was how two adults learned to coexist without friction. I didn't notice how often my silence filled the space where my voice used to be. The change extended beyond the walls of our home. Invitations became easier to decline, not because I didn't want to go, but because coordinating felt complicated. He had preferences, comfort zones, a tolerance for social engagement that varied depending on his mood. I began to filter invitations automatically. I said no on our behalf before asking him, saving us both the discussion. Friends understood, or at least they stopped asking follow-up questions. At gatherings we did attend, he was different. Warm, engaging, attentive. He remembered names, told stories, made people laugh. I watched others respond to him with genuine affection, and I understood why. That version of him was easy to admire. Standing beside him, I felt oddly peripheral. Not excluded exactly, but unnecessary. He carried conversations effortlessly. I listened, smiled at the right moments, filled in small details when asked. I became a supporting presence rather than a participating one. On the drive home, the warmth faded. He grew quiet, focused on the road, the day behind him. When I tried to continue a conversation that had started earlier, he responded briefly, as if the energy for it had been used up elsewhere. I told myself everyone had different social batteries, that it made sense for him to give his best energy outward and rest at home. I adjusted accordingly. Friends began to feel like something I used to have rather than something I actively maintained. Calls were returned later, then not at all. It wasn't intentional. It was just easier to let the distance grow than to explain why my availability had changed. I became smaller socially without ever deciding to. The last shift was the quietest and the most consequential. I stopped trusting my instincts. When something felt off, I searched for a rational explanation that didn't involve my perception being correct. When I felt dismissed, I assumed I was being sensitive. When I felt overlooked, I told myself I hadn't been clear enough. "Maybe I'm wrong" became my internal refrain. It wasn't self-criticism, it was self-correction, a constant recalibration away from my own judgment. Decisions that used to come easily now required confirmation. I asked his opinion on things I had once handled independently, not because I needed permission, but because his response carried a certainty mine no longer did. If he questioned a choice I'd made, even lightly, I revisited it immediately. I adjusted, I revised, I apologized for misunderstandings I couldn't quite define. I still functioned well. From the outside, nothing appeared broken. I managed schedules, responsibilities, obligations. I smiled. I kept things running smoothly. But internally, I had begun to defer to a version of reality that wasn't mine. It didn't feel like losing myself. It felt like maintaining harmony. I believed that if I could just align more closely, anticipate more accurately, adjust more gracefully, things would feel balanced again. I didn't see that balance requires movement from both sides. By the time I noticed how quiet I'd become, the quiet felt familiar. I didn't feel trapped. I felt reasonable. I wasn't unhappy. I was simply no longer certain. And certainty, once given away in small pieces, is difficult to reclaim without first realizing it's gone. The papers arrived without warning. No conversation, no preparation. Just an envelope placed on the kitchen counter as if it were something I had asked him to pick up on the way home. The language inside was precise and impersonal, each sentence doing its job without hesitation. Dates, accounts, requests, everything laid out cleanly as though our life together had been a clerical error that needed correcting. He didn't watch me read them. He busied himself with something else, rinsing a mug at the sink, checking his phone, moving through the room with the ease of someone who had already stepped into the next chapter. When I finally looked up, he met my eyes briefly and said, "It's better this way." Not kindly, not cruelly, just factually. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because my body seemed to know that any other response would require energy I didn't have. The humiliation came later, in a room much like the courtroom I would sit in months after, though at the time I didn't know it would matter. We were meeting with a mediator, neutral walls, neutral tone, a process designed to keep things orderly. He arrived early, greeted everyone with a firm handshake, a calm smile. He spoke clearly, reasonably, as if he were explaining a plan he had already thought through. When it was my turn to speak, he interrupted gently, not to argue, just to clarify. He reframed my words into something simpler, more manageable. The mediator nodded, scribbling notes. No one corrected him. No one asked me to continue. I stopped talking. It wasn't dramatic, no raised voices, no sharp exchanges, just the quiet realization that my version of events no longer carried weight in rooms where decisions were being made. I felt myself recede, the way I had learned to do, and this time I didn't try to stop it. After that, things moved quickly. Accounts were separated, access changed, expenses that had once been shared became mine alone without discussion. He didn't argue over numbers. He didn't need to. Everything had already been calculated. Emotionally, the cut was cleaner than I expected. He stopped checking in, stopped asking questions, stopped acknowledging the space I was moving into. When we spoke, it was about logistics only. Keys, dates, forms. His tone remained steady throughout, as if consistency itself were proof of fairness. I didn't ask him to reconsider. I didn't ask him to explain. I didn't plead for anything to be different. Not because I was strong, but because the words wouldn't come. My response to it all was stillness. Friends reached out at first, a few messages, a few invitations that I declined automatically. I didn't know how to explain what had happened without sounding confused, and confusion felt private. Over time, the messages slowed. Life continued around me without requiring my participation. The house grew quieter, not in a peaceful way, in a hollow way. I moved through rooms that no longer felt shared, touching familiar surfaces that now belonged only to memory. I kept things clean, organized, functional. It gave me something concrete to manage. He moved on efficiently. New routines, new priorities. When we crossed paths during the transition, he was polite, composed, unchanged. There was no visible cost to him. That, more than anything, confirmed the finality of it. I froze in those months, not emotionally numb, but paused, as if some internal mechanism had decided that movement was unsafe until further notice. I did what needed to be done. I signed where required. I showed up when expected. I didn't fall apart, but I didn't advance either. There was no dramatic confrontation to mark the end, no final argument, just a series of small closures that sealed themselves without ceremony. The absence of grace wasn't loud, it was procedural. By the time the separation became official, the shape of my life had already changed. The loss had been absorbed quietly, piece by piece, without asking for acknowledgement. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel relieved. I felt reduced to essentials. And in that stripped-down state, there was nothing left to negotiate. The house sounded different once he was gone. Not louder, quieter, but not in a way that felt restful. The quiet pressed in from all sides, unfamiliar and exact. Every room held its breath. There were no footsteps to anticipate, no routines to anchor the hours, just space. I moved through it slowly, learning the new weight of things. A single mug in the sink, one set of keys on the counter. Evenings stretched longer than they used to, not because I was lonely, but because there was no one else's rhythm to follow. Time stopped borrowing meaning from someone else's presence. Fear lived there with me, but it wasn't frantic. It sat calmly, waiting its turn. Alongside it was something else I hadn't expected. Clarity. Not reassurance, not hope, just a clean awareness of where I stood. One afternoon, I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years. It held old files, neatly labeled, the kind of organizational habit I'd maintained without thinking. Financial statements, tax returns, insurance documents, the record of a shared life reduced to paper. I didn't set out to look for anything specific. I simply began reading. Dates aligned themselves into timelines. Numbers formed patterns. Transfers repeated at regular intervals. Accounts I recognized and a few I didn't. Nothing about it felt dramatic. It felt administrative, the kind of task you do when you need to understand something before you can move forward. I spread the papers across the dining table, aligning edges, stacking by year. The process was methodical, almost soothing. Each document answered a question, then raised another. I followed the sequence carefully, resisting the urge to jump to conclusions. There it was. Not a secret in the way people imagine secrets, no shocking revelation, just an inconsistency, small enough to be overlooked if you weren't paying attention, significant enough to matter once you saw it. I traced it back, then forward, cross-referenced statements, dates, signatures. The picture clarified itself without resistance. He hadn't lied outright. He had omitted, redirected, assumed I wouldn't look closely. When it settled fully into focus, my body reacted before my thoughts did. My breath paused, suspended between inhale and exhale. My hands stopped moving, fingers resting flat against the paper. The room felt heavier, as if the air had thickened around me. I stayed that way for a moment, neither startled nor panicked, simply still. Then I exhaled. There was no rush of emotion, no anger, no sense of betrayal sharp enough to sting, just understanding, clean and undeniable. I gathered the documents and placed them back into their folders more carefully than before. I wasn't upset by what I had found. I was oriented by it. The uncertainty that had followed me for months began to lose its grip. This wasn't about revenge. It didn't even feel personal. It felt factual. I continued organizing. I noted dates, made copies, marked pages quietly. Each step grounded me further. The fear didn't disappear, but it shifted. It no longer asked open-ended questions. It narrowed its focus. That night I slept without replaying conversations, without rehearsing things I wished I'd said. My mind stayed where it was, anchored in the present, aware without agitation. In the days that followed, I reviewed everything again, slowly, carefully. I wasn't looking to confirm a narrative. I was making sure the reality I had seen was complete. It was. The stillness of the house changed during that time. It became less hollow, more intentional. I moved through it with purpose, even when that purpose was simply to sit and think without interruption. I didn't feel powerful. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt informed. That mattered more than I would have guessed. There was a moment, standing by the window one morning, when it occurred to me that this was the first time in a long while that my understanding of the situation hadn't come through filtered sentiency from someone else's certainty. The realization didn't produce relief, it produced alignment. For the first time since the erosion began, I wasn't adjusting myself to fit an explanation. I was holding the explanation steady and adjusting my next steps to match it. I closed the folder and placed it back in the drawer, not because I was finished with it, but because I knew where it was now. It would wait until I needed it again. The quiet remained, but it no longer felt empty. It felt resolved, as if something inside me had stopped searching. I didn't yet know what I would do with the clarity I had found. I only knew that it had changed the ground beneath my feet, and that once changed, the ground does not return to what it was. Preparation didn't arrive with urgency. It settled into my days the way routine always had, quietly, intentionally, without announcement. I found an attorney through a referral, not because I was searching for an advantage, but because I needed precision. Our first meeting was brief. I explained what I knew, what I had found, what I didn't yet understand. I didn't editorialize. I didn't dramatize. I laid out facts the same way I had laid out documents on my dining table. She listened without interrupting, asked questions that were specific and unembellished. When she spoke, her tone matched mine, clear, grounded, focused on sequence and consequence rather than emotion. That suited me. Preparation became part of my week, not consuming, not obsessive, just present. I gathered records, requested copies, confirmed dates. I created folders, labeled clearly, updated as needed. Each task was small on its own. Together they formed structure. There was something steadying about it, not empowering in the way people describe sudden confidence, but stabilizing. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was responding. I noticed the change in myself in subtle ways. I stopped rereading messages for tone. I stopped rehearsing conversations that hadn't happened yet. My attention narrowed to what mattered and ignored what didn't. That shift felt less like growth and more like return. Self-respect didn't announce itself either. It appeared quietly in moments I didn't expect. When I corrected an error without apology, when I asked for clarification without qualifying why, when I said no to a scheduling request simply because it didn't work for me. None of it felt defiant, it felt appropriate. My husband remained unchanged. When we crossed paths during the preparation period, he was relaxed, casual. He spoke as if the outcome were inevitable, already settled in his favor. He made comments that suggested patience, as though this process were a formality I needed time to accept. I listened. I didn't respond. There was no satisfaction in watching him underestimate me. I wasn't observing him closely enough for that. My attention was elsewhere now, on timelines, on consistency, on what could be demonstrated rather than assumed. Court dates were scheduled, deadlines set. Each step moved forward without friction. The machinery of it all worked as designed, indifferent to narrative, uninterested in performance. I didn't feel brave. I felt prepared. Evenings returned to a rhythm. Dinner at the same hour, files reviewed once, then set aside. Sleep came easily. My mind no longer circled unanswered questions. It moved in straight lines, from one task to the next. There were moments when I recognized the shift fully. Standing in line at the courthouse to submit paperwork, sitting across from my attorney as she explained procedure without simplifying it, walking out of her office knowing exactly what would happen next. I wasn't reclaiming something that had been taken. I was standing in something that had been there all along, waiting to be occupied. The night before the final hearing, I reviewed everything one last time, not because I doubted it, but because completion has its own rhythm. I placed the folders back into my bag and turned off the light without hesitation. There was no anticipation in my body, no fear, no hope, just readiness. As I lay in bed, the thought came without force, without ceremony, settling into place as fact rather than feeling. अब वापस जाने का कोई रास्ता नहीं था. I slept well. The courtroom felt different this time. Not warmer, not more welcoming, just precise. Everything had a place and everyone seemed aware of it. I sat at the same table, hands folded the same way, posture unchanged. Across the aisle, my husband looked much as he always had, composed, confident. His expression carried the mild patience of someone waiting for a process to finish. He nodded occasionally as his attorney spoke, relaxed in the familiarity of procedure. I didn't look at him for long. There was nothing new to learn there. When my attorney stood, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't frame the facts with emotion or commentary. She presented them the way they existed, in order, with dates, with references, each document introduced calmly, without emphasis. I listened, not as a participant, but as a witness to something unfolding exactly as it had been prepared to. The room remained quiet. Papers were passed, screens were adjusted. The judge followed along, eyes steady, expression neutral. No reaction, no interruption, just attention. Across the aisle, my husband shifted slightly. It was subtle, a small change in posture, the crossing and uncrossing of an ankle. He leaned in to whisper something to his attorney, then leaned back again. The ease he had brought into the room began to thin, not disappearing, just losing density. The facts continued. There was no moment of confrontation, no sharp exchange, just accumulation, one point connected to the next until the shape of it became unavoidable. The consistency spoke for itself. Nothing needed interpretation. When his attorney stood to respond, the tone changed, not dramatically but noticeably. Explanations replaced certainty. Clarifications were offered where none had been needed before. The confidence that had once filled the space now moved more cautiously, testing each step. My husband's expression tightened briefly, then settled again. He nodded less. He stopped smiling. I remained still. I didn't look toward him when his name was mentioned. I didn't search his face for recognition or reaction. That part of the story was no longer mine to manage. The judge asked a question, then another, both precise, both directed. The answers came slower this time, measured, considered. At one point, the judge looked directly at me, not with warmth, not with sympathy, with acknowledgement. She spoke my name clearly, without embellishment, as if anchoring the facts to a person rather than an argument. The sound of it landed differently than I expected, not as validation, as recognition. I met her gaze and nodded once. Nothing more was required. The room continued forward from there, guided by process rather than momentum. Decisions were outlined, clarifications made. The tone remained even throughout. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. When it ended, there was no pause for reaction, no dramatic shift, just a sense of completion, the way a task concludes when it has been done thoroughly. My husband gathered his papers more slowly than before. He avoided my eyes, not deliberately but instinctively, as if the habit of ease had been interrupted and hadn't found its replacement. His attorney spoke quietly to him, pointing to something on the page. He nodded, though his attention seemed elsewhere. I stood when instructed. I followed procedure. I listened to what was said and noted what mattered. My body remained calm, my thoughts clear. There was no surge of satisfaction, no sense of victory, just alignment. What I had known privately now existed publicly, without distortion. As we left the courtroom, the air outside felt unchanged. The hallway sounded like any other hallway. People passed without noticing us, carrying their own concerns forward. Life continued at its usual pace. I didn't look back. What had been resolved didn't need revisiting. It had been addressed with the appropriate weight, neither exaggerated nor minimized. Justice, I realized, doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply takes its place, quietly, where confusion once stood, and that was enough.
The decision took effect without ceremony. Dates were set, orders were issued. The language was precise, neutral, complete. I read it once, then again, not to search for meaning, but to understand the shape of what came next. The outcome was fair. That was all it needed to be. I didn't feel happy. Relief came first, quiet and unannounced. It settled into my body the way tension leaves, not all at once, but gradually, in small releases. My shoulders lowered, my breathing slowed. I noticed the absence of urgency more than the presence of anything new. There was grief, too, not sharp, not overwhelming. It moved through me gently, touching places that had been held still for a long time. Grief for what I had believed in, for the version of the future I had adjusted myself around. It didn't demand attention. It simply existed, allowed. I didn't feel the need to explain the outcome to anyone. There was nothing to justify. The process had spoken for itself. I informed the few people who needed to know, briefly and without detail. Conversations ended naturally, without commentary. The days that followed were unremarkable in the best possible way. I returned to ordinary tasks with a steadiness that felt earned. Groceries, laundry, paperwork completed and filed away. Life resumed its pace without asking for reflection. I noticed how little space he occupied in my thoughts, not because I was avoiding them, but because there was nothing left to resolve. The questions that had once pulled at me had been answered. The uncertainty that had shaped my movements no longer did. There was no desire to revisit the past or rehearse it differently. No interest in measuring what I had gained or lost. The accounting had already been done. Some evenings I sat in the quiet and let it remain quiet. I didn't fill it with distraction or narrative. I allowed it to be what it was, a pause without expectation. Stillness, I learned, isn't empty, it's complete. And in that completeness, there was space enough to breathe without waiting for permission.
My life now is quiet in ways that feel intentional. Mornings begin without urgency. I wake when I wake, not pulled by someone else's schedule or expectations. I make coffee and drink it slowly, standing by the window, watching the day arrive without needing to interpret it. I trust my decisions again, not because they are always perfect, but because they are mine. If I change my mind, I do it without apology. If I don't explain. The constant internal negotiation has ended. There are small moments that remind me of this shift, choosing what to cook without considering preferences that aren't present anymore, saying yes or no based on my own energy, sitting in silence without wondering how it's being perceived. I don't feel the need to be understood by everyone. I don't feel the need to be impressive. What matters feels smaller now, and because of that, more solid. The past doesn't pull at me. It sits where it belongs, behind me, complete. I don't revisit it for clarity or closure. Both have already arrived. What surprised me most was how little I needed from the outside once I stopped doubting what I carried inside. Approval lost its weight. Comparison lost its grip. I didn't replace them with confidence. I replaced them with steadiness. There is no glow anyone else can point to, no visible transformation, just a sense of being fully present in my own life again, without shrinking or adjusting. I live here now, inside myself, and that has proven to be enough. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who understands quiet strength. Sometimes healing isn't loud, it's the courage to begin again. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your stories matter here.